Hi, welcome back. Now that you are ready to run an experiment using the chemical reactions model, I want to give you an example on how to use the experimental design form. This form will help you design a more complete and comprehensive experiment. So we're going to start with a question. My question here is, what is the effect of the initial amounts of silver nitrate and copper reactants on the amount of silver produced? You want to determine one independent variable and what is the dependent variable that you will measure. The independent variable that I'm going to look at and vary is the initial amount of silver nitrate at a constant amount of copper. The dependent variable is going to be measuring the amount of silver produced. You also want to think about what are the values that I'm going to test and try, and there might be a reason behind that, there might not be, except that you want something that is valid in your experiment that you can actually try. So the amounts of silver nitrates that I'm going to use are 75, 150, 225, 300, 375, and 450. I have a slider if you remember, and that's going to make it a lot easier to make those changes in the values. The amount of copper is going to stay constant at 150, so you do want to run at least 3 trials at each setting of your independent variable. You want to confirm that your experiment really works and that your model is valid. The data that I will collect will start with recording the initial amounts of copper and silver nitrates and the initial amount of silver, which should be 0 if you click the setup button. Then we'll let the model run, and once the one of the reactants have been completely used up, we will stop the reaction. We will record the amount of silver produced. The data analysis would involve putting the data in a table and then calculating the difference between the initial and final amounts of each reactant in order to get the amount of reactants that was used up. We will determine which reactant was the limiting agent at each setting and the amount of silver produced at each setting. All that will go in a table. Then we will go to the interpretation. We have to go back and remember what the question is. In this case, the question was, what is the effect of the initial amounts of silver nitrate and copper reactants on the amount of silver produced? The interpretation will determine which reactant was the limiting agent at each setting and will determine the amount of silver that was produced. And we'll look at if there are any ratios or any relationship between all these amounts. One last question has to do with the prediction. What was your prediction, and did the prediction align with the interpretation of your data? So my prediction is that since I know the chemical reaction and I know the chemical equation and I have balanced it, my prediction is that 150 copper will react completely. It will require 300 silver nitrate agents and it will produce 300 silver agents. At a setting of silver nitrate that's below 300, the silver nitrate is going to be the limiting agent. But if we have more than 300 silver nitrate, then the copper is going to be the limiting agent. Because in this case, we're keeping 150 copper agents constant. So this is one way of trying to run experiments and design it. Please use the experimental design form. It will help you focus on one question, on one variable at a time, at multiple settings. Remember that this is only an example. You might have a completely different question to begin with, or a completely different design. Take care.